reasons for this. The one was that there's an awareness, I think, or I would hope, that the conflict in Yemen has led to likely today's worst humanitarian catastrophe or crisis anywhere in the world. There are millions and millions of Yemenis who are unable to access food or water, and many civilians who have been killed by the conflict. And linked to that, there's an understanding that there are weapons companies and states across the world that are profiting from this conflict. Two of the main external protagonists, being Saudi Arabia and the UAE, have an almost constant supply of weapons. And so what we wanted to work out was, are South African companies a part of this story? And also, are there South African companies that are also the subsidiaries or partners of companies in other parts of the world who aren't able to export to Saudi Arabia because of various bans in place, who are using South Africa to get weapons there? And I suppose the overarching conclusion is, unfortunately, the answer to those questions is yes, in the sense that South Africa and South African weapons companies are supplying quite large amounts of weaponry to both Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and that there's evidence that those weapons are being found on the ground in Yemen, including in places where they've been used allegedly on civilians.
Also, Michael, I think the numbers speak for themselves. And when one looks at Saudi Arabia, for instance, we're talking of about 2.8 billion rand to Saudi Arabia. We're talking of another 4.7 billion rand that has gone to the UAE. And as this report states, that this conflict obviously became internationalized, and obviously this entire web of secrecy sometimes surrounding some of these deals that have been taking place, but also at the same time in terms of where does one's allegiance lie? Does it lie with profit, or do you care about humanity? Do you care about a humanitarian crisis? And I think this is where this entire debate or this discussion, obviously as per this report, is going.
Absolutely. And our Department of International Relations has been very clear that South Africa's stated foreign policy goal is centered on human rights, that it's supposed to be a human rights-centered focus. And also South Africa's legislation surrounding weapons exports is also centered around human rights, at least on paper. And so what we discuss in the report is the legal requirement to get a permit to export weapons. And that requires the regulator, who's the NCACC, to consider very carefully whether there's a risk that those exports will be used either to worsen conflict or be used in the commission of crimes in violation of international law or violating human rights. And so it's not something that's not codified. It's very clear that South Africa, in terms of its domestic law and its international law, is supposed to be guided by those human rights considerations. The problem that we see is that in practice, that hasn't happened. In practice, there's been an understanding that South African weapons firms rely on the Middle East, and particularly the UAE and Saudi Arabia, as a vital market for their weapons. Since the war started in Yemen, we're talking about between often 25 up to 50% of all exports of weapons in a given year going to those two countries. And so the weapons companies are very clear that they don't want that to stop because it brings in a huge amount of money for them. Unfortunately, South Africa's law on this, we feel, is very clear. And we feel that the regulator has been essentially derelict in its duties in not taking these things into consideration.
Yes, and I like what you say. You talk about in practice what has happened. And I think the key issue here, Michael, is everyone seems to have climbed on the bandwagon at the misery of the Yemeni people. And when one looks at not only South Africa, but right across the entire world, when one looks at countries like the US, the UK, the value of arms that have basically gone to these countries. And at the end of it, the report details also the death, the destruction, the carnage, the mayhem, the brutality, the genocide that has been committed against the people of Yemen.
It's absolutely true. As you say, South Africa is not the only country that's profiting from this conflict. Unfortunately, there is a pattern throughout our history that war is profitable for some and that it is big business. As you say, the United States and the United Kingdom are by far the largest supplier of weapons into this type of conflict. The evidence from researchers in the United Kingdom shows that the Saudi Arabian Air Force essentially would not be able to operate its constant aerial bombardment in Yemen without the support of British companies. And so what we hope this report does is it is not a focus on everyone who's complicit in that war, but it is saying that South Africa has become party to it, that it is in some very unfortunate company as a part of a group of states that is not observing these kinds of human rights laws and violations. And just something to add on this point is that as awareness and pressure comes on states to stop weapons supplies to countries involved in the war in Yemen, the real risk, I think, is that companies based in those countries might well try and move their production facilities to places like South Africa where exports are still possible. And this is something we focus on in the report. The big company that we focus on in South Africa is a company called Rheinmetall Denel Munitions, which exports large amounts of weaponry, including mortars and other things that have been found in Yemen. And the parent company of Rheinmetall Denel is Rheinmetall, a German company, and they are currently prohibited by domestic German law from exporting to Saudi Arabia, and yet their South African subsidiary is still able to. And it's a serious concern that if this kind of impunity continues in South Africa, that we may well become a jurisdiction that is used by companies around the world to evade bans in other places. And I don't think that we want to become known as the country that's responsible for that.
Well, exactly. And I think also an important point that has been raised is now that South Africa is a democracy and having come from an ugly history of apartheid, and the report speaks about Armscor and how Armscor had emerged as one of the top companies. And even at that point in time, criticism that was leveled against Armscor, which obviously fueled apartheid, as a result of the weapons that were produced. But now we have a different scenario playing out where we have, as you mentioned, Denel, for instance, fueling our, obviously conflicts for other reasons. And this is what we'll be talking about, the humanitarian crisis that has unfolded, where we've seen, just so much happen in a country that has basically been destroyed into what we can call the Stone Age as well, Michael.
Completely. And it is important to remember that our current constitutional order and all the laws around weapons exports that are part of that emerged as a direct response to South Africa's past. South Africa itself relied on the complicity of other states to provide them weapons illegally in violation of an embargo to subjugate South African people. And then in turn, South Africa, under the apartheid state, was exporting weaponry to conflicts around the world without any concern for how they were used. And the Cameron Commission of Inquiry in South Africa's first democratic administration recognized this and said, actually, the new legal order has to reject this. It has to be based on transparency, human rights, and openness, rather than kind of secrecy and impunity. And so this whole legal order or edifice was constructed in order to build in those controls. And unfortunately, what we see is the NCACC as the regulator is completely failing to fulfill its mandate and enforce the laws. And in our investigation, their response to us essentially shows that, because it shows that even though the evidence of what is happening in Yemen is very easily and publicly available in terms of both the crimes and the human suffering, the NCACC simply hasn't properly taken it into account when deciding whether or not to approve weapons exports.
Yes, and obviously the whole question surrounding secrecy comes under question finally, Michael. Just to talk about, how transparent are the processes as far as arms control goes in this country?
There is a degree of transparency, but it is not sufficient. At the moment, what we have is we have reports that are made by the regulator to Parliament sporadically. Over the past 10 years, they've often been late, and they show what permits have been granted in terms of which countries, and also the amounts and the type of weaponry going. Unfortunately, that reporting is not sufficiently up to date. It's not regular enough. And there's also not sufficient transparency, and this is a crucial thing, into the decision-making process. So we have no insight at the moment into how and whether the regulator is making the kinds of decisions that it makes and what it's taking into account. And so this is one of the fundamental things that we've called for in the report, is greater transparency in this regard, so that the public can hold the regulator to account when it makes these types of decisions.
Well, Michael, thank you very much for that and for your time with us this morning. I'm sure this is not the end now that this report has been released, and I'm sure there are many issues that obviously would arise. But for now, thank you for your time. All the best to you.
Thank you so much.
Michael Marchant joining us this morning, researcher at Open Secrets, and this was the expose, South Africa's role in Yemen in the civil conflict and ultimately leading to the humanitarian crisis.